shutting down a business, it actually can feel in the moment like, oh my gosh, what am I losing out on? What is all of that? But I think to be able to navigate through that and find the freedom and the clarity, I love the fact that you use that word.
Yeah. Yeah. And I know it doesn't feel like that in the process, but I think for me, being years after I closed my practice, I can kind of see that for that therapist, that it's in the throes of potentially thinking of this choice, and that, I think something better can come on the other side of it. So
Hello. Welcome to today's session of Selling the Couch. I hope you're doing well, having an awesome day. So today's podcast is about shutting down your private practice. I know this is something most of us are usually not considering, but inevitably we come to a point where we make a decision with regard to our private practice. So one option is selling the private practice in some sort of capacity. The other is to actually shut down your private practice. And so I'm joined today by my friend, Dr. Jennifer Blanchette. Jen's website is over at drjenblanchette.com. And Jen navigated this during the early years of the pandemic of shutting down a private practice that she had worked so hard to build. It came from a combo of things, including burnout and just realizing that Jen wanted to focus on other things, and also just how do you navigate this whole process? And that's what we're talking about today. We cover a number of different things. First of all, from the real emotional side of shutting down a private practice, both client terminating with clients, as well as you having to do all of these logistical things while navigating the fact that it's a very emotional process that brings up a lot of guilt and shame and all of these things for many clinicians. And how do you navigate that in real time as a clinician? Jen shares a lot of the tips and things that she wishes she had known in the early stages in that whole private practice closure process. And then we get into some of the logistical things to consider, including, what do you communicate with your liability insurance? What's the actual timeline that Jen recommends in terms of shutting down a private practice? I think you're going to find this conversation just fascinating on many levels. So here's my conversation with Dr. Jennifer Blanchette from drjenblanchette.com. Hey, Jen, welcome back to Selling the Couch.
I'm so happy to be here again. Thanks for having me back.
Well, before we even jump into all this, I'm so thankful for you. I'm thankful for our friendship. We've built a really nice connection over the past year. And just the ways that you have been so encouraging. You really embody what you talk about. And I'm just so thankful for you. And especially as we navigate this conversation, which is shutting down a private practice, what therapists need to know. You've done this and have navigated this. So I'm thankful for you and excited for just a raw and honest conversation.
Yeah, thanks so much for having me. And I'm excited to have this conversation because I know what potentially can come on the other side of that, which looks like maybe some freedom, maybe something new for someone who's been considering this change for a very long time.
Yeah, I think even just you use that word freedom, and I think that's so true, because I think in the throes of us doing anything big like that, like shutting down a business, it actually can feel in the moment like, oh my gosh, what am I losing out on? What is all of that? But I think to be able to navigate through that and find the freedom and the clarity, I love the fact that you use that word.
Yeah. And I know it doesn't feel like that in the process, but I think for me, being years after I closed my practice, I can kind of see that for that therapist, that it's in the throes of potentially thinking of this choice, and that, I think something better can come on the other side of it. So, yeah.
Yeah, no, absolutely. Even as I was thinking about this conversation, I wanted to, keep it very practical, and maybe we'll just start here. So let's imagine someone is listening to this and they are thinking about shutting down their private practice. What's like how far in advance should they start planning?
Yeah. So it will depend on what their practice entails. Generally, I would say around 90 days is a good rule of thumb. But if you're thinking about retirement, so if you're a psychologist, therapist, you have been in private practice for years and years and years, and it's retirement, then perhaps you want to take 6 months to a year to think about having a longer closure process. And I think at least 90 days, because it's going to take you a lot of time to look up all the requirements necessary for closure, to call your liability insurance carrier, to look up the regulations in your state or province, if I know this is worldwide. So it might be different for someone who is international, like what that process looks like in wherever you live. So it does take a lot of time. And I think we might get into this, but also emotionally, it's hard to hold all of those termination sessions, I think, to have like a 60-day or 30-day close. So I really recommend 90 days minimum. And I've helped someone close a practice in as quick as 30 days, but I don't recommend it. It was just a choice they had to make more medically. And why I think I want to open that up for people is that sometimes they can't. They can no longer provide the service. So perhaps there is a medical situation where someone is incapacitated and they just can no longer care for a client anymore. And so they might need to think about a quicker close to their practice.
Yeah, I love the way that you're thinking about this because you're right. Like there's like a logistical thing and then there's like an emotional part to it, right? And then like you said, there are these exceptions where it's like, wow, this is something I did not expect. And now I've got to make this decision very quick. Which leads, I think, to the second question of, and maybe this does depend on circumstance, but like how far in advance do you start communicating this with clients? Because I can imagine like for most clinicians, there's the inevitable tension they're feeling of like, do I tell them soon? And then does that mean like all my clients are going to leave? Or do I tell them too late? And then it, creates some sort of rupture. Like, I don't know, how do you even navigate all of that?
Yeah, I think the 90-day timeline really sets the clock. We have our clock going, and having that 90 days and then sending out your letters either through a portal message or snail mail, which I recommend actually, because then you have a record of that you have sent a snail mail paper letter to your client and it's out there. That sets the clock, and some people might not come back. They might choose to send you a message, I'm just going to close right away. Some will be there. Literally, you're moving furniture out, before their session. They will be there in that last day that you are there. So I found, and it will surprise you, like who will actually still stay with you in your practice on that last day or towards those last days, and then who might decide to wrap up more quickly. Like, oh, well, actually therapy feels like it's kind of done. So maybe one more session. And you're like, okay, sure, we'll do that. And so I think for the therapist, it takes, it's a heavy emotional load to bear because there's all these reactions that clients are having, and then we're having our own reactions. How can we not? These are relationships where we've invested our time, our energy, our deep care. And of course, we're going to have our own reactions. And I think grief and your own trauma and all these things come up in this process that I became acutely aware of in going through it. It just felt like huge losses, saying goodbye to these people that I genuinely still care about and think about all the time. So.
Wow. Like I feel like every time we have conversations, inevitably it gets like deep and emotional, right? Like even as you were talking about this, I just like that part you said about, all of our stuff also coming up, and it's like a grief. So you're trying to like both contain your grief, but then there's like these logistical, practical things. And then there's an element of volatility, which is like what you alluded to. There could be clients that you were like, yeah, I think they're gonna stay till the end, and then they're like, no, I want to wrap up. So there's like all sorts of interesting things that one has to navigate. I mean, I don't know, how did you handle it, like for you when you closed your practice, like those levels like that?
Yeah, it's hard to kind of remember my mind space at the time.
Mhm.
I think I was coming out of like a deep level of burnout, and that was part of my decision. I said in 2021 that I don't think I can be a therapist anymore. And then it took me 2 more years to ultimately close my practice. And I think at that time, I was more than ready to do that. I think I needed a change for a long time. And I think I, as much as possible, tried to hold the space for them. And I didn't really have time during that space where I needed to hold it together. Essentially, like I had to have my heart somewhat guarded so that I could do that. And I think therapists don't realize just how much we do that every day. We show up for sessions, we show up for people all day long. And I think the toll that it takes on us to do that doesn't allow our own emotional processing to happen, probably till after. And I think the grief kind of lens of this is helpful. Like in an acute crisis, like let's say you had a loved one that was sick and you had to take care of them. You continued to provide that care. You couldn't quite fall apart at that time. So possibly it came in the weeks and months after. And that was my experience too. So I felt like there was a lot of holding for me, and rightfully so, because I wanted to end well with those clients. I needed to get them to people if they wanted a referral. I needed to help them have this process where they could have a good goodbye with me. Maybe they hadn't had that before. And so I think to provide that, I had to hold a lot and wait for that time to have my own healing, if I'm honest.
This reminds me a lot of this conversation I had. I think it was during practicum, like how they, like a supervisor would say, like a therapy session's like a container, right? But I think in this whole process, like it is like we have to contain our emotions around this while simultaneously getting like new data and new information. It is a lot. Like, what do you think, in hindsight, looking at it, like at a 40,000-foot view, what do you wish you had done emotionally in that process of closure that you would do now that you didn't do?
Yeah. I think emotionally I would be more kind to myself, if I'm quite honest. And I see that show up in the therapists that I work with it's emotional because I see it in them too. They feel so responsible and guilty and shame for making this decision. And I felt all of that. I felt a deep sense of like, what are people going to think? I built this thing. It was my baby and I'm letting everyone down. It felt like so much loss. And in that process, I think I judged myself too much. And I think I would have held myself really tenderly. I would have asked for more support from the people in my life, because I think in the process of the pandemic, being a therapist, I became very untethered to my supports. And I think a lot of us did, but especially in those pandemic years, being a therapist in those pandemic years, my support network really dwindled. And so I would call more support. I would call in the favors. I would tell people, bring me lasagna. I mean, I needed it so much more than any time in my life. And I was still trying to give beyond what I had to give. I remember distinctly, like, I was in a church group at my church at the time, and someone had a surgery. No, they had something happen. Maybe they had a baby, but I just recovered from surgery and I did not have it to give to bring this meal to this person. And still I was doing that. I was still doing so much when I needed. This was a season where I tell therapists, you need to be selfish. You need to tell people you are not available because emotionally you do not have anything else to give, because this process is so difficult and trying. So that's what I would say.
Thank you for sharing that. Like, thank you for, because I think these are the things that we don't often talk about and definitely doesn't ever show up on, rarely shows up on social media, right? Like all of the guilt, the shame, the competence sort of thing of like having built this, and especially for so many of us, we're like high achievers, right? And so, and as I mean, I'll just speak for myself. Like, I feel like as much as work as I've done on separating the business from my identity and the ebbs and flows of the business from my identity, it's still so hard, you know?
Yeah.
And yeah, and in that moment, like, just to navigate that. And I mean, the other piece you alluded to, how so many times, as clinicians, we're givers, and asking or even setting a boundary for ourselves to say, like, I can't, like, I'm running on fumes, or I at least need to. I mean, you and I had a conversation on your podcast recently, and that word came up around margin, right? Just accounting for having more margin than you know that you need.
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, I think in this process, in helping therapists close their practices, I never thought this is what I would make a course on or do. It just became a problem that people needed my help with. And helping them create the margin to close actually was part of it. I think for some of them, they just felt so overwhelmed. And I'm like, well, let's think about discharging clients who have met treatment goals. Like, are they meeting treatment goals? Do they no longer need treatment? And that ethical question of termination, I think we don't sit with in long-term therapy enough, because if the work is stagnant and if we're not looking at that frequently, and I did this was part of my problem, is I didn't really look enough at how I was able to hold clients, honestly. But doing that work creates that space where they do have more room. Like, okay, what are the two clinical pieces of or clients in the week that are depleting you the most? Okay, let's think about referral or discharge potentially with those clients. And it's like, what? I can do that? Therapists, look at me like with, three eyes, like, no, I can do. Yes, you can do that. You can do that. But I don't think we're trained that way. We're given a caseload when we're in our training. Here's your clients. That's what we do.
Right.
We take the clients that are given many times. And so when we come to private practice, we start taking anyone that we can start to see. And that may not work the best for us.
Right. Yeah, I think what you're alluding to is such a fascinating thing, which is, often as we approach private practice, we do what we have often been trained to do. And if there's like parameters, like I remember a lot of my practicums and trainings were at university counseling centers. And so generally some of them like had, as long as you were a student, you could be seen, but others, especially toward the latter stages, had session limits, right? And so when you have that, like, it makes sense, but then you go into private practice and you're still trying to like navigate that because there isn't that parameter that's there.
Right. And I think many times, for myself, like having a practicum year, 2 practicum years, a internship year, postdoc, couple years, each year or two, I was moving on and I was wrapping up treatment with that client. So I didn't have the experience of holding clients for a longer duration of time. And I don't know if that's necessarily something in our training, because most of us aren't coming from psychodynamic programs where they probably talk about that more often. But I wasn't trained in that modality of care. So I didn't really think to frequently more assess for fit in the therapy room. And I think some clients can just continue to come, though. Like, I just like my therapy and this is my hour and that works for them, but it may not work for you. It may not work for you as the therapist anymore.
Jen, just shifting a little bit, you shared earlier about canceling liability insurance. What would you say like are the top 3 like legal or like logistical tasks that a therapist may overlook when winding down. So, for example, like canceling liability insurance or like business registration, stuff like that.
Yeah. So logistically, definitely contacting your liability carrier first is one of the things that I recommend. So they typically, like I'm with the trust for psychologists, and if you're with another carrier, they have a legal person, a lawyer on staff that you can have a meeting with, and they'll go over with you, all the things you need to think about in mind as you're thinking of mindful closure. And that would include like record retention, like how long you need to, retain records for that client, any notices. So some states have weird requirements, like Florida, you have to run an ad in the newspaper, like the physical newspaper in 2025 that I don't know who's looking at that, but it's still in state law that we have to do that. So there's some weird kind of like legalese that happens for closure that I think some therapists aren't aware of. To contact them first, contact your state board. I did that. They did not get back to me. And I think like 3 months after my closure, they got back to me with that. But I think therapists often get hung up on like, what am I going to do with my records? Like that's the first thing they need to think about when I steer them back to, we need to think about your timeline. So if you do still provide care through insurance payers, you need to contact them and figure out, is there a notice from that payer that you need to give 60 days or 90 days for a referral? So just knowing like what legally am I obligated to do is important, I think, as first steps. And then thinking of then the actions related to termination that we need to do ethically as providers, which is separate from that. And sometimes in your state law as well.
Yeah, I never, canceling liability insurance seems like a very logistical, practical step, but then all of the little unlocks that, for example, having the attorney, like those are, I don't know, stuff that I would think you just normally would not think about.
Yeah. And I wouldn't say canceling liability. So the only reason why you would cancel liability is if you're retiring and you want to contact your liability carrier to see what the tail would be for the policy. So the tail is basically that you continue to have coverage even after closure. And like for the trust, they include a tail with your policy. So I still practice as a psychologist. So I work in schools still. So the only reason would be to consider if you are retiring to cancel liability.
Interesting.
Yeah.
Okay. So I'm going to ask a lot of silly questions. This is
Sure.
one of them. So let's say that you shut down your practice. And so in your case, you're still working as a psychologist. Let's say that you shut down your practice and then let's say you go start to work as a coach or something like that. Like, do you still maintain the tail just because to overlap with however long you need to keep records, or how do you think about that?
Yeah, you would still keep your tail. And so contacting the liability carrier, they'd give you all that information and give you recommendations based on how long your practice was open and if claims can be made, it's depending on state law when claims can be made against you, like for the treatment that you provided. So it really is state specific. And so contacting your liability carrier is first. And then they'll always tell you likely to contact a local attorney because state law is specific. So if you really are risk adverse, then I would say contact a local lawyer. But if you have already done the legwork, it's less money. Like in the course that I've developed is drafting a termination letter for your clients and then having a lawyer review that is going to be much cheaper than, can you draft me a termination letter for my practice? So if you use my templates or templates that you find, there's also some other ones online, that's going to be a lot cheaper than going to a lawyer and asking them to draft that just from them. If that makes sense.
Yeah, that makes perfect sense. What kind of lawyer do you reach out to do this?
Yeah, someone who is an expert in healthcare or in mental health law in your state. So typically, like for me, like the main psychological association might be a good resource, or wherever you are located, your association would be a good resource to kind of find recommendations for attorneys in your state. And sometimes, like when I called the trust, they actually gave me some recommendations of lawyers too. So
that's good to know. Jen, I have two final questions for you. So, and they're pretty rapid ones, but the first one is, what's the most common mistake that you see therapists make when it comes to shutting down their practice?
I think not having enough support, honestly. I think trying to do it all solo and not having the support that they need. When that's the multi-layered, even in the best of circumstances, closure is going to be difficult on you. And I think building your support team is something that I would recommend, like medical, psychological, financial, legal, if you need it. And like if you had a booking, I can't think of what I'm saying. Someone who does your books, a
Yeah,
professional.
like a bookkeeping
Bookkeeping,
professional.
yes, a
Yeah.
bookkeeper. So, having that team around you that can assist you in the process.
It's a really great answer because I think, especially for many solo practitioners, I mean, this is something I still navigate, which is my default mindset is like, how can Mel take this on and try to do this versus,
Right,
you
right.
know, and just, yeah, and being like thoughtful again, building the team, not because you may need it in this particular moment, but knowing that those supports are there for as you go through this process. Jen, the final question I had for you is, what's one piece of advice you wish someone had told you about closing a practice that you didn't know when you got started?
Yeah. Yeah, I think it's going to be one of the hardest professional things that you'll do.
Mhm.
And you still need to do it. And you can end well. You can do this really well. And to remember all of the wonderful things that you did in your practice. And I think when you're closing, you're flooded with things that you feel like you're doing wrong because it's an ending and a failure, perhaps. For those in retirement, maybe it's a little easier because, they have those years and they've had this long practice. And so maybe it's easier to have that consolidation of the work. But I think just to know that, you did really great work and to find ways to celebrate that too. So multi-layered answer to that one.
Yeah, it's a great one because, and the thing is, I don't know, I'm taking away is, shutting down a practice, right? There are so many reasons for it, right? But I think for many of us, it can be about our own competence. Like, why didn't this work? And I think like what I'm really taking away is like, understand and appreciate all the layers that go into it, but also don't tie it just to like that being the main reason and then kind of the shame spiral and all of the things that come with that.
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, think of like all the clients you served, like how much care you provided
Mhm.
and how many lives that might have touched.
Yeah. Yeah, it's a great way of putting it. Jen, you're doing some pretty amazing stuff in the world. You've got a course coming out. Please tell us about the course, also where we can connect with you.
Yeah. So I've developed this course. It's ethical practice closure. And that is coming out in October. So hopefully at the time of this recording, it'll be out, but I will have a freebie at least ready for you. And that's the quick start guide for your 90 days. So the first step that you need to do, I have a freebie for you. So if you need help with that, I have a quick start guide if you want to close your practice, and also some just practical tips on the emotional side of things that I've seen from working with therapists in this process. So if you want to connect with me, the best place to do that is on the podcast. And I don't know if we can put a link to the freebie that I'll have
Yeah, of
at that
course you can.
time, perhaps.
Yep. Yeah, we'll definitely drop that. We'll drop that in the show notes for you guys. Jen, thank you again for doing this. And you guys are listening, definitely connect with Jen, especially, quite active on LinkedIn as well. So definitely connect there. And Jen, appreciate you. I know this is a very hard topic, one we don't often talk about as clinicians. And yeah, just thank you for both your courage to go through your own process and shutting down your practice, but then having the courage to help serve our field and helping colleagues navigate it as well.
Yeah, it's my pleasure and my honor.
Have a great rest of your day.
Bye.
Hey there, I hope you enjoyed my conversation with Jen, and especially if you are navigating shutting down a private practice, I hope that today's conversation has been incredibly helpful for you. Jen is just one is just a wonderful human being, and I'm just so grateful that she is in our field, and definitely reach out to her if this is something that you are navigating. You're going to be in really good hands. Can just Jen is has been on the STZ podcast twice now, and one of the things that I've appreciated every time is that she takes such a holistic and human approach to something as difficult as shutting down a practice. As I was thinking about this conversation, I learned a lot, and among them, I had no idea about this whole like tail policies, and even thinking and navigating that. Like, who knew that was something that you had to factor? So, and if you missed that part of the conversation, so basically, when you have your liability insurance and you're shutting down your practice, you actually need to. Uh, there's some policies have what's called a tail policy, so it basically accounts for clients that you've terminated with, but after you shut down your practice, but are still in that sort of window where there's potential liability. Jen again is creating a wonderful course that should be live when this podcast comes live. I'll put the link to the 90-day shutdown, the free guide that Jen put together, and also the link to the course as well. But you can, in the meantime, you can check out again Jen's website over at drjenblanchette.com, and be sure to connect with Jen in on LinkedIn as well. She talks a lot about the sides conversations around like burnout in among therapists, as well as just some of the logistical and practical things of shutting down a private practice. Have a great rest of your day, and I will see you next time. Bye.